A few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came towards them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once, Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Again, we see Peter in the Gospel accounts being impulsive. He wants to show everybody he can walk on water, as he sees Christ doing. His impulsiveness and his showing off, I think, is clear in the gospel. Today I want to talk a little bit about something that is mentioned here that we often don't pay a whole lot of attention to, but it's three little words. It is a ghost. A ghost. But before we start into that, just a little reminder of what the abstinence of fasting, the laws of abstinence of fasting concerning receiving communion, as I see people in the congregation chewing gum. Don't present yourself for communion if you're chewing gum. There's an hour fast. We shouldn't be chewing gum or candy. If we're diabetic and we have to take medication or we have to take something, that's one thing. The church has room for that. But to simply disregard the hour of not eating something that we have to keep before we receive communion is like spitting in God's face. It isn't much. It used to be, for us a little bit older, you remember that it used to be from the night before until the next day you went to Mass. You couldn't eat or drink anything. Then it was midnight, and then it was 3 hours, and then it was reduced to 1 hour by the Second Vatican Council. And an hour isn't too much to ask. So I just simply want to remind you of that because a lot of times people come up with painted tongues. And what I mean by that, I know they've been sucking on candy because their tongue is dark red or blue or green or whatever. If we've been chewing on candy, gum, we're breaking our hour fast. So please think about that. I've not mentioned it before, but I'm mentioning it now. And for the last 4 or 5 weeks, I've been talking about the proper order way of receiving communion, and I'm not going to go back into that, but just a little reminder. As we always have people, we have many visitors here, of course, who don't hear these things from the pulpits in their own home parishes sometimes, or maybe some do, but the idea is, and the regulations too say that if a person is carrying something in their arms like a child, you don't place communion in their hand because the danger is the child can grab the host, the child can move suddenly, the host can be dropped on the floor. You cannot receive in one hand. I have a lot of people who keep doing that. I don't know why. They keep sticking one hand forward. You can't receive communion in one hand. I will deny you communion. I'm not being a hard-nosed, I'm just following the rules. But I was instructed in school in what is proper and what is appropriate to what we're supposed to be doing. It's not a big deal. To make a throne for the king, right? 2 hands. It's the proper way of doing things. Not to receive Christ like you're dipping water. were not to snatch him out of my hand and not to trap him. You know, I love the trappers. You know, they take the host and then they trap Christ. Like somehow he's going to jump out of their hand and escape, like a frog. Then you got the hoopsters, the basketballers. You know, what if they miss? What if they miss that big hoop? And it doesn't go in there and ends up in their eye, or it falls on the ground. Yeah, we have some of those too. You know, there's a proper way of receiving. I'm only mentioning it because I know our visitors, you may have not heard this stuff in your own parishes, but there is a proper way of doing these things. And I think it was last week, having mentioned it, just like I did at the beginning of my homily, there was a lady came forward who was carrying a child, and she received communion in her tongue, but the moment she went to stick out her tongue, the child jumped in her arm. And it jerked her. Now imagine for a moment if she had had her hands out and I put a host in her hand. Christ would have dropped on the floor. Yeah, that is a big deal, by the way. We don't drop Christ on the floor. We receive him into our beings, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So she came up to me after Mass and she apologized, but she said, you know, Father, look, you were absolutely right. She said that was a perfect example of why one should not receive in the hand when they're carrying a child. Had I stuck on my hand, I would have lost the host. And when you come forward, if you have ink on your hands, if you have dirty hands, if you have wounds on your hands, cuts and Band-Aids and so on, I'm not obliged to put communion in your hand either. I would just place Christ on your tongue. And it still is the universal norm, and I've talked about this anyways. The universal norm is still to receive on the tongue. It's the Bishops' Conference that is allowed in some dioceses, most of the dioceses in this country anyways, to allow people to receive communion in the hand, which the Second Vatican Council, and Paul VI actually did the survey on this, and he asked the bishops around the world whether we should change to receive communion in the hand or should we continue to receive kneeling and on our tongue. And the answer came back absolutely universally from the bishops, over 5,000 bishops around the world, that we should maintain receiving on our knees and on the tongue. That has never changed. The universal norm of receiving communion has never changed. It's still in place. No priest may deny you receiving communion on your knees. No priest. If he does, you write to the Vatican Embassy down in Washington, D.C. and let them know, because they have already told us they themselves will reprimand the priest. Receiving the hand was an indult that was granted by John Paul II only in tears. He didn't want it. But they forced his hand. He didn't want to do it. Because he knew it would open up a can of worms. And the disrespect that came from it over the years. As I told you this story about a friend priest of mine who told me he found 21 hosts stuck underneath the pew. 21 hosts. And one priest, one of the ushers caught the lady taking the host back to, taking the host back to her pew where her dog was sitting, and she broke it in half and gave half to her dog. This is the kind of ridiculousness of what people do. Because for them, Christ is a ghost. He's not real. He is simply a ghost or a shadow. Now the apostles had last seen Jesus feeding the multitudes. But now he comes in and walking on the sea in the midst of a raging storm. Jesus is clearly exercising roles that in the Old Testament belong strictly to God. Certainly to feed people, but the man in the desert is one of them. And also Jacob describes the stretching out of the heavens and the trampling the back of the sea dragon. The Hebrew for the last phrase admits both this more mythical translation and, a matter of fact, he trampled the waves of the sea, which sort of is more correct translation of walking on the sea. In either case, to walk or to trample is something symbolic. It represents dominating. The incident is clearly portraying Jesus as deliverer of his own people from all powers that would enslave them. Either the powers of the world or the struggles of their own interior chaos. Now, last night in my homily, I talked a little bit about that interior fear that the apostles were going through. They had a collected fear. All of them were afraid. All of us are afraid of something. Whether it's a snake, a spider, whether it's the boogeyman underneath the bed, whatever, it doesn't matter. We all have a fear of something. But Christ wanted them to go through this fear. Because every human being in life goes through chaos and struggles. Fear is very much a part of it. If one loses a job, fear becomes a part of it. How am I going to feed my family? How am I going to put food on the table? But what Christ is teaching his apostles, don't allow fear to paralyze you. But that's what happens. It paralyzes us. A friend of mine some years ago had lost his job. So he tried his own business. He tried his hand in his own business. He did good for a while, then he lost all of his contracts, and before you know it, he had nothing. What settled into the family was fear. I had to walk with him every day to get through this time period. I said, look, trust in God. Get your resumes out there. Do what you can. God will provide. And all this negativity, this collective fear in the family begins to dominate. So one day the phone rings. And somebody from the United States government calls this friend of mine to offer him a job that he never applied for, he never signed up for, he never called for. He didn't even know this job existed. Never saw it on a computer, never heard of the people. They invited him to come for an interview. He went to an interview and got the job. Making more money than any job he had before and more money than he was making on his own when he had his own business. And I told him at that moment, you see what happens when you trust in God? When you don't allow fear to control you? I had to remind him every day, God will take care of you. He will take care of you. And if it doesn't happen according to your schedule or the way you like it, that's too bad. Let God work. He will do. He still has that job, by the way, after about 17 years, 18 years, I think. He's now been jumped 2 or 3 positions. He's in a manager position making 6 figures. A job that dropped out of heaven into his lap he never looked for. And I still remind him whenever I talk to him this day, remember where you got that job. God gave it to you. Be grateful. But all of us need to be grateful for all the things that we have. Now, why does Matthew put in that Jesus was walking on the water on the 4th watch of the night? Well, everything, as I always tell you, in the Gospels has a purpose. He puts in the 4th watch of the night to tell us exactly the time frame. They had left the shore in the evening time. Christ went up to the mountain to pray, to be alone with his Father. Now, the 4th watch of the night, and if you don't know anything about the Roman watches, Jewish watches, basically, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. was the 1st watch. From 9 p.m. to midnight was the 2nd watch. From midnight to 3 a.m. was the 3rd watch. From 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. was the 4th watch. So now we know exactly what time, or not pinpoint exact, but we know the time frame. Matthew obviously wants us to know the time frame. That Christ left them on the sea in that storm for 10 hours. But he knew what he had in mind for them. He knew that through it all, once he calmed the sea, they would calm down. And what's their answer in the end? Truly, you are the Son of God, huh? We all have to go through chaos and struggles in our life to come to God. There is no easy way. There's no shortchanging. I can't sit on a couch and eat potato chips all day and come to God. I can't waste my time on an iPhone and a computer and a television set and come to God. I have to go through the struggles and the difficulties of life. Not to go to escapism, escaping through these technology and these things, to forget about my problems, or to get on drugs, and so on and so on. But God is always with us to bring us out of chaos. Now he teaches his apostles that it's according to God's time, not your time. He wanted them to experience this difficulty, and in the end, basically, they had a common fear, a fear that was united. Where the sea almost takes on life of its own. Even though the sea has no life on its own, doesn't have a soul, doesn't breathe. But it almost, for them, takes on a life of its own. Don't our fears sometimes in life take on human form? We give them life. If we see a snake, what's our reaction? Run like hell. It's my reaction. Snakes don't really bother me, but as long as they're not poisonous. Spiders? But you certainly want to get out of the way of a car that's busting down the street, certainly. You have a fear you might get run over. We all have fears of some type, but the idea is not to allow them to paralyze us. Don't become paralyzed in your fear. And there are some fears that we've had since we've been children. They developed when we were little, and they're still with us, and they will grow with us all the way, sometimes, into our graves. And in the end, what happens to that fear, there's nothing but chaos and destruction in the soul, within the human being. And because of that, the human being perceives Christ as a ghost. Why is it that Matthew puts that in his gospel so clearly? Because it happened. It happened to the disciples, but it has happened for 2,000 years and is happening today. For how many Christians, I don't care whether they're Catholic or other Christian denominations, is Christ simply a ghost? He never becomes real. He never becomes my absolute everything and my love. He never reveals himself to me. I never experience him in life. I know about Christ, and many people know about Christ. There are many people who can read the Bible from cover to cover, but they do not know Christ. They think they do. To know something, you have to experience it. To know Christ, you have to experience Christ. But many people in this life will never experience Christ. They go to Mass on Sundays. They receive communion. They've done their part. At least they tell themselves they've done their part. But God never becomes an experience and an absolute reality and an absolute truth and an absolute love for them. And the absolute fulfillment of life and everything that I was created for, because that's what I was created for God. But for most human beings, we never go that far. Because it's a rough road, and it's a hard road. It means to let go of all the other things that stand in my way, including my fears, my doubts, my ignorance, and to pray much. People don't pray very much anymore today. People don't go to Mass during the week, hardly ever. In most parishes around the world, well, people say, well, they got an excuse, so I got to work, it's fine, I'm not here to judge anybody, but the point of it being is, if we knew that Christ was real, and that one day I'm going to stand before that absolute reality without denial, would I live my life differently? Probably. Most likely. I would probably treat my spouse differently. My children, my friends, my dog, my cat, doesn't matter. Even strangers. I would treat them differently. Because I know God exists and God has created everything. And I have no right to harm or hurt anyone in any way, shape, or form. I know there are many people, like I said, they go to Sunday Mass, they receive communion, but a lot of people simply do it, I think, also from a perspective, just in case there is a God, and He's not a ghost. Maybe God will let me into heaven because I went to Mass. Well, a person can still go to hell for the sins committed during the week. So you got to stop telling yourself that one. The idea is when we go to church, I don't care whether it's a daily Mass or a Sunday Mass, the idea is when we go to church at any time, to get closer to Christ, to allow God to become more real and defined for me. That He may become an experience for me, not just a book, not just a story, not just a historical Christ, but the absolute reality of the living God here and now. That's why Peter's words became so important. You are the Son of the living God, and Jesus said to him, you've answered correctly. He couldn't have simply said, you are the Son of God, because that would have placed Christ into time. At a particular spot, end of story. The living God is always alive and present. He's been with us for 2,000 years. Body, blood, soul, and divinity, altars of the world. Real. Absolute truth and reality. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. All of us probably have looked at the crucifix for many, many years of our lives, and never realized, or at least we thought we knew, what those words on top of the cross mean. Here hangs the King of the Jews, an abbreviation in Latin. But if you take those exact same letters in Hebrew, it says one word: reality. Christ is reality. He's not a ghost.